How is alimony calculated for high net worth earners? So that high net worth earners is, it can be a little bit vague, but really what we want to be talking about here when we calculate maintenance, we apply a statutory formula. And the nice thing here is we don't have to argue about what does high net worth mean. We've actually already defined that in the statute. If the payor, or really the combined income, is $500,000 or higher, then the formula no longer applies. In a situation like that, we're going to be looking at what's equitable under these circumstances and these facts, because we're not going to just take a straight percentage. This is where you're going to need a good lawyer on your side to make sure that we're advocating for a proper division of spousal support. How is that going to be decided? Well, a lot of it's going to be based upon needs and based upon the lifestyle that you've been accustomed to, because a lot of times people think, well, they don't need this much money. That's true. But what was the lifestyle that you guys established during the marriage? When we're divorcing a couple in any situation, whether you have $1 million a year or $50,000 a year, we want to try and maintain the standard of living that the parties would have enjoyed had the marriage not been dissolved. So in a high net worth situation, what we have to try and do is we have to figure out what's going to be the proposed lifestyle going forward. How long should it be? Well, that's often going to be decided by the statutory factors, or at least it's going to be a guidepost. So if you've been married for 20 years or more, maintenance is typically indefinite, meaning it's going to last until there's a substantial change in circumstances. So when deciding how to calculate maintenance, it's important that you have a lawyer in your corner that can help you to step back and see the big picture. Perhaps you could avoid maintenance altogether by giving a larger portion of assets or taking on more liabilities. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, so it's important that you have a team in your corner that understands what you want and can negotiate or ultimately advocate on your behalf. Alimony is different for high net income people. If you make more than $500,000, there is not a statutory formula where the court's just going to say, okay, we're applying this. Now, you can still use the statutory formula and see what that might be. And in fact, that's kind of a common starting place. Under the formula, what you do is you take 33% of the payor's net income, you subtract 25% of the payee's net income, and you figure out what that number would be. Now, it should be no more than 40% of the combined net income. So you can use that as an argument. In other words, depending on what side you're on, you might want to make that argument in your favor. So if you are the recipient and you are not working, you might say, I should get 40% of the net income, or even higher depending upon the circumstances. So it's really important that you have an understanding of what you want, what's most important to you, whether it's cash flow or future assets, retirement assets. It's all different. We have to understand, where are you now in life? Where do you want to be? And then we create a plan for that. There's no magical formula. That's the important thing to understand. When you are above $500,000, there's not a formula that you're automatically going to put into place. When we're talking about the formula, the starting point would be 1/3 of the payor's net income, but you have to subtract 25% of the recipient's income. So if the recipient has $0, then the starting point would be 1/3 of their income. But the statute also says it can be up to 40% of the combined net income. So what does that mean? Well, if one party has all the income, you could make an argument that we should have 40% of the combined income. A lot of that's going to go into, well, how did that income come about? Was it all earned during the marriage? Did they get to the salary they're at now before the marriage? It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So let's just take some examples. Let's say that there's $1 million of net income per month. When we say net, what do we mean? Well, it's after what we project the taxes to be. So gross income, take out what we think the taxes are going to be, and that's going to be your net income. We're not talking about living expenses. We're not talking about vehicles or anything like that, because quite frankly, we could really fudge those numbers a little bit more and more depending upon what side you're on. So you're taking gross income, subtracting what we project the taxes to be, and that's going to be our net income. And let's face it, that's got some problems with it because, as we know, your net income is not decided until you actually file taxes. Well, we're guesstimating what we think the taxes are going to be. It could be higher or lower depending upon politics. That can change those things. So when you're looking at this, you have to understand it's going to be an inexact science as is. When you're going to be asked to pay alimony, in a high net worth situation. What can you do? Well, the first thing you got to do is step back and try to figure out, what do you think they want? What does your ex want? Are they out for vengeance? Are they out for short term, long term? Because if we can understand what we think they want, we can try and create a plan of action to satisfy what they want, but protecting what you want. Because we got to assume we know what you want. And if you want to minimize what you're paying on a monthly basis, well, you may be looking at longer term things. Maybe you give up more retirement assets. Maybe you give up more physical property or other stocks or other things that might be of value in exchange for freeing up your monthly cash flow. Now, on the other hand, you can also maybe make it a lump sum payment. You could offer like what they call maintenance and gross, where you create a number and you say, I will pay this number maybe in a short period of time, but that's it. That's all you get. So there's a variety of ways you can go about doing this, but the most important thing is we have to figure out, what do you want? What do you think they want? And how can we go about creating a plan that's going to get both accomplished? If you're a high net worth individual, you need to make sure that you have somebody in your corner that understands high net worth. Let's face it, not a lot of people understand what it's like to live a certain lifestyle, and you need to make sure you have a team of lawyers and a legal team in your corner that understands what those things mean. They understand where your assets are, and they understand how much work you did to get those things. So it's important to protect them. If you find yourself in that situation, we'd be honored to help you.